Hey, so just wanted to come in here and rant for a little bit, because not only because I want to be more consistent with making these videos, at least on a weekly basis, but also because there's just a lot going on right now, and I have plenty of stuff that I'm working on that I want to put out there, but in the I just think sometimes it's important to just rant, to just be like, what the hell. And yeah, so we'll see where this goes. I have a little bit of notes of things I want to talk about, but you know, we'll see where this goes. So the main thing that comes to mind for me at this moment is just all the crap that's going on. Let's link things together. All right. I think there's a relationship between what's going on with the mass deportation with ICE, with going on over in Israel and Palestine, what's going on in terms of like all the stuff going on in Africa, and many places around the world, in Ukraine, things like that. And then on the culture side, if you want to call it that, in terms of the manosphere elements that has been cropping up more and more recently, the the just all that mess, probably go into it more or less. And then on the other side is, or on another side, in the urban planning in the real world, if you want to say, is not that the first couple stuff is real world, obviously, but in terms of real world from culture, online culture, but in terms of urbanism, things around car culture, things around the housing crisis and food instability, as well as going back to like the online spaces, things around technology and big tech, the AI stuff that's going on. So all of this, in my mind, is related, right? How? So the main thing that relates all of these to me is hierarchy, right? Is power, is authoritarianism, and all these different facets and things like that. And I think it's very important to name because I feel like, especially in this day and age where we're connected to the internet, you see everything happening, this, that, and the other, everything just feels so chaotic, and just like all these problems seem bigger than any one person can deal with. And they are, right? It's not for you to fix alone, it's for us to fix together, right? But I think a big way of understanding that is by understanding how we can fix it, right? And that comes by understanding what these problems actually are. It's easy to sit back and be like, "Oh, these, there's nothing we can do. It's just politics. It's technology. It's war. It's whatever, right?" And just kind of throw your hands up and be like, "Oh, whatever. It's all these things." But to me, these are all related to the concept of hierarchy, right? To the concept of having a form of power that is inherently, if you want to call it in the simplest form, is evil, right? Why? And I say that because hierarchy, the power of authoritarianism, necessitates, right, taking away power from everybody else, right? It necessitates the oppression of other people, right? That's literally what it is, right? The authority to do something means you're coercing people who don't have that authority, who don't have that power to do the thing that you want them to do, right? And there's a myriad of ways in which we do that, and there's a myriad of ways in which we try to justify that, right? By saying, "Oh, you have the political power, right? They were voted in." This is a democracy. Or some people even just go so far as to say, "Oh, they just like that, right? They just have the military power, all right? Or they have the even on the personal level, it's because they have a gun, right? Or because they're bigger and stuff like that, right? Or they have more money, right? All of these, I want to say excuses, are excuses for to justify this authoritarian relationship, to justify this ability of some people to oppress other people, right? And when you begin to see it like that, it becomes very clear what we have to do, right? It becomes very clear where to go to actually solve a lot of these problems. And quite frankly, as you probably have guessed by now, I would imagine if you watch this channel by any any stretch, is that this is the sort of thing that led me into anarchism, right? That led me into the idea of egalitarianism on a mass scale, right? And the reason why is precisely because growing up, I had all these ideas of how to change the world, how to fix all these problems in the world, right? I'm not gonna rehash my whole story. I say it all the time, but I was obsessed with the idea of inventing things, of becoming a trillionaire in order to solve the world's problems. Invent hover cars and smart cities and all this other stuff, and that's how I would make the world a better place. But then you look at people like Elon Musk, Musky Boy, as I like to say, and you begin to realize that it's not enough to just have a bunch of money. It's not enough just to have a bunch of inventions, even, right? It's not enough to just do a bunch of things that seems like they're making the world a better place, because you realize it's not about technology. It's not about just having better leaders, right? It's about the fact that there is people who have more power to do things than other people, right? And you may think that, oh, this is a age old problem. Humans have done this since time immemorial, right? It's the way of things. But then if you have any sort of inclination to reading history, and specifically that's how I got in through anthropology and stuff like that. Obviously, from a layman's perspective, like I didn't go to college for any of this stuff, but because we live in an internet age, you can find all this information yourself. You can just look up how people used to live in different times. And that's when I began to realize, oh, this is actually not super tied to what it means to be human, right? Granted, yes, humans have had authoritarian, societies for a long, long time, since the dawn of civilization, in fact. And you may think that means since the dawn of humanity, but that is not the case, right? Because as you read into more of these anthropological studies, and again, I've said this many times before. I think I have a whole series. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I recorded my whole a new story of human history, whatever, where I shared a lot of my learnings over the past years. But long story short, you know, civilization itself is literally biased towards hierarchy, and specifically civilization as certain peoples have described civilization, right? Which tends to be a Eurocentric view. That definition of civilization literally biases towards hierarchy, saying, oh, in order to have a civilization, you have to have a social hierarchy of some sort. And I think that is short-sighted, but also like terrible. It literally justifies oppression. It literally justifies saying, oh yeah, we have to have some people who get, you know, I always go back and forth to whether I want to curse, but yeah, I do, because sometimes it's just more appropriate. It justifies people getting fucked over, you know, time and time again. That says, yeah, that's how we got to do it. That's what life should be like. And I think that's terrible, right? Because like I said, as you look into history, you see that people have lived different lives for a very, very long time. You know, humans themselves have had foraging cultures for 100,000 years. And I always think it's important to say that, because civilization as we know it only has lasted 10,000 years, where humans have existed for 300,000 years. And in that time, they've, you know, explored all sorts of different ways of life. And of course, people will say, "Oh, they haven't achieved much. They're all impoverished and stuff like that." But honestly, that's a really dumb way of looking at it, in my opinion, because we would not have got there if they were all impoverished. Because the very idea of poverty, right, means that you are not getting what you need to live. That's what poverty is, right? You're not getting the food, the housing, you know, the safety, security to live a good life. And if you think that was the norm for humanity, then we would not be here, right? The very idea that we would, that we're, you know, that people lived until the age of 30 and then died, right? That's not true. The life, the idea of the average lifespan is almost like a trick of statistics, in that it's the fact that most people died in early ages, right? And not by old age, but by disease, right? Disease was one of the biggest killers of people for most of human history, and most of that impacted the first 0 to what I think 9 years or something like that. Infant mortality itself was super huge, and like 50% of people born died like in just trying to get make a baby, right? And that skews the average down, right? If people are dying at literally year zero, then of course the average life will be heavily skewed down towards that era. I think that there's a term called senescence or whatever, which is the actual lifespan that people have, right? And furthermore, the health span. And many studies show that that was in around the 60s, around 60 years for a long time, and it has recently moved up to like 70, 80 years. But either way, that's not a huge difference between like 60 and 80. And even then, even back then, there's still proof that people have lived to 90 or even 100 in some cases. It's rare, but there is some elements of that, right? So it wasn't impossible. All that to say, I'm not trying to romanticize these times and go back to primitive times, right? I just think the way we frame things is extremely important, right? Because you have to recognize that there were some things that people were doing for 100,000 years that might be very useful for us to do today, right? I love technology, right? This is why I call myself a techno wizard, right? Because I think technology is one of the greatest things that we can possibly do. That's literally what sets us apart from every other animal on this earth is our intellect, right? Not even intellect, but specifically our ability to be self-aware, our awareness, right? The consciousness, if you will, which is not necessarily the same as intellect. Because if you look into it, and I know I'm going on all sorts of asides here, but this is part of why I wanted to rant, is because, there may be other animals that are more intellectual than us in terms of pure processing power or pure ability to memorize a bunch of things. Like elephants have longer memories than most people, right? Dolphins have an extremely complex social intellect and like what do you call it, like society, I don't know what you want to call it, community communication style that is way more complex than we give them credit, that most people realize. And ants, for instance, are extremely smart in terms of their ability to, again, have that social if you want to say hierarchical, relationship and stuff like that. So all that to say that there's intellect in many other ways that we don't usually perceive. I'm not saying that we're not smart. Obviously, we are. But all that to say that I think what sets us apart beyond just pure intellect is specifically awareness, right? It's a specific type of intellect, the ability to reflect on things, the ability to actually look at something that you did and then be like, why did I do that? To look at yourself, looking at yourself even, right? That metacognition. That is, if not rare, it might even be singular. Like as far as we know, I don't know if we have any sort of evidence that other animals do that, right? And I bring all that up because in today's time, it seems like we're losing this ability. We're losing this ability to be metacognitive, to be self-aware of what the hell we're doing. Because if you're thinking about it, right, they have this idea of being reactionary. Our entire society is almost built on being reactionary, in which when somebody does things and you do things too. That you see that happening, so now you're trying to copy, right? You see that in business, right? The entire idea of capitalism is this idea of the marketplace, free market, right? Which is not really, but it focuses on this idea of competition, where you're focusing on what somebody else is doing in order to beat them, right? In order to be better, to have more profits, to have more power, really, is what that creates. And in the side of politics, you see the same thing, especially in terms of short-term politics, where, and it really actually not. It's not just short-term. It's technically, not even technically, literally, it happens the same way in monarchic, power, where either way, the point is to be in power. It's to get as much power as you can and retain that power, right? That element forces you to look at other people in a competitive way in terms of how can I maintain this power, how can I get more power, and now you're focused more and more on that power aspect rather than your own fulfillment and your own sense of relationship with where you are with everybody else and your impact on the world and things like that, right? You're only looking at, if you do look at your impact, you're only looking at it in terms of what is my legacy going to be, you know? And that legacy is extremely constrained. It's not even thinking about, you know, how that impact affects the world positively. Half the time, it's just thinking about, well, people remember you in 100 years, right? Just build a statue, which says nothing about, like, did you actually help, you know, people? How many people did you help? How many animals did you help? How many trees did you plant, right? None of that is countered into this idea of legacy and power relations. We see that in terms of urban planning, you know, where you're just building more roads, building more buildings, building more parking decks and things like that, and end up destroying the entire environment to the point where most people don't even think about what the environment wants, right? What the environment needs, right? We're not thinking about the tree that we cut down when it's just in the way. You know, we half the time we don't even think about each other when we're driving. You know, I was just listening to a great podcast by Seriously Wrong, talking about car culture, and one of the things they were mentioning was how, like, even though it makes sense to, like, for instance, to slow down in a school zone, right? Because you want to make sure the kids are safe, right? You want to make sure, you know, these you're not running over any children or anything like that. But most drivers will probably tell you that it feels almost wrong to slow down in a in a school zone, right? It's one of those, like, dark urges you have where it's like, oh, why am I slowing down? Yeah, I see this. There's no kids anywhere. You know, why I gotta slow down and stuff like that. Like, I even feel this, and I don't like driving, right? But I see it as, like, if I have to drive, I want to be as efficient as possible. So I try to, you know, just go right, like, as quickly as possible from point A to point B without, you know, being reckless or anything like that. And so when you have to slow down in a school zone where it doesn't even, like, seem like the school is open, so there's literally nobody out, but, you know, you're trying to follow the law and stuff like that. So even me, like, who does not like driving and wants to, you know, be conscious and aware of things and stuff like that, like, the very element of driving, right, being behind this machine, and I really like how they call it a death machine, right? Because cars is one of the leading causes of death by a large margin than most other things. And here in America, it's only second to gun violence, right? And that's crazy. That's crazy. Something that's literally built for death, the gun, is just barely over, you know, cars, right? Anyways, all that to say that when you're all these aspects of our society, right, it really restricts your ability to be more aware, to be more aware of yourself, to be more aware of other people, in a holistic way, not just, oh, that person is just doing the thing because I don't like it, or they're just trying to be angry, or they're just trying to be rude, or you only see that person in such a narrow view precisely because of the way in which our technology, our society, and our culture, right, narrows down the idea of what it means to be human, right, and that really takes away from so many elements of ourselves, and then the idea of nations, right, is another huge element of this, where your identity is tied to this idea of the nation, right? America, right? Or Israel, or whatever other nation you're in which you're not even thinking about the other people in which your nation impacts, right? Like I could say, we say all day about how America is an empire, right? And its power greatly depends upon the oppression of other people, right? The vast majority of the products that we get in here comes from China, and a lot of those comes from sweatshops and things like that. A lot of the energy we get comes from oil, which comes from the Middle East, which, you know, a lot of oppression there. A lot of the things that our technology runs on, the minerals that our technology needs, is from the Congo, you know, in Africa and things like that, and a lot of oppression there. Terrible. And so it's like our entire empire, right? Our entire nation is built upon the oppression of other people. And if you try to say that, people are like, oh, so you're anti-American, you know? Ooh, why don't you go over there then? Like, just think for a moment what you're doing, right? You're narrowing down your sense of identity so that you no longer care about your other fellow humans who are just like you, but just happen to be located in a different place on this earth, right? These are the same people as you, but because they're located somewhere else out of view, unrelated to you, then you don't care about their issues, right? You don't care about how your life, right? How all the things that we have, right, is literally built on their backs, right? On their blood. And so what does that do to your mind, right? What does that do to your soul? What does that do to our society, right? It makes you less human. It dehumanizes all of us. Dehumanizes the people who are higher up in the hierarchy because you're no longer able to think about other people as full people. Because literally, if you were in a hierarchy, right, and if you were to think about the people below you as full people, then your mind will literally break, right? Like there's a reason why there is more psychopaths and sociopaths found at higher levels of management, for instance, because like literally that's the type of person that it takes to rise to that level, right? I've talked to so many people, especially when I was in my networking bag, and these different companies and things like that, where I would interview people or I would like try to form connections and things like that. And the best people, like the people who I actually like talking to, tell me all the time how like their experiences at the higher levels of what they do of their craft is horrible, right? Oftentimes, where they reach this level of incredible ability and like money and power and all this other stuff, and like they look around them and it's like it's being in a room full of serial killers almost, where other people just don't care about you. And these I'm talking about like these are people who I deem as like very good people who they try very hard to keep their empathy. They try very hard to check their privilege. They try very hard to recognize that what got them there to that level is not purely them, right? They will say, oh, they're talented. And I would say that too, right? They're talented. They're incredibly intelligent. They're incredibly driven, right? Incredibly hardworking. But they would be the first to tell you that still a lot of that still came from luck, right? A lot of that still came from circumstance. A lot of it still came from privilege. And these are the people that are very rare to find, right? Or even if they're more common, they don't like being in those circles, right? Because it becomes very constricting and very, cutthroat and things like that. And you hear that all the time when you look at celebrity interviews or whatever. You can tell a difference between people who actually like have some humanity in them still, and versus those that don't. That's just like, I'm just here for the money or the power or the influence or whatever, right? So all that to say that like it can be very easy to throw up our hands and be like, oh, there's no way we're going to solve all these problems, right? It's so complex, it's so big, it's so frustrating, that we think we just have to survive, right? We just have to put our heads down and let somebody else figure it out. But what that does is that takes away your power, right? That's the other problem with hierarchy, is that the people on the bottom think that they have less power than they actually do, right? Because by many standards, it feels like you have less power. It's probably true that you have less power. It's definitely true that you have less power, right, than somebody with way more money and political power and things like that. But the fact is, by the simple nature, the simple calculation of there being a hierarchy, there's literally more people on the bottom than there is at the top. So by definition, you have more power with the other people who are around you, right? And it circles all the way back to what I started with in terms of ICE and one of the things I really want to talk to, especially for people that look like me, is this idea that you are going to just throw your hands up and be like, oh, that's not my fight. They voted for who they voted for, or immigrants, they don't be on our team. They're not our peoples or whatever. And that is extremely short-sighted. And don't get me wrong, it's understandable, right? As a person who has been in environments where it seems like everybody's against you, I read through Afro-pessimism, or not all of it, but because it gets very depressing for me. But I get it. I get the Afro-pessimistic view that everybody sees you as a black person as the enemy, or as just the oppressed, as lesser than, right? You always feel like you're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom, right? And so when somebody else is going through some things, when somebody else is the enemy, right, or is being more oppressed, it seems like they're, they're at the bottom now. Now you want to be like, oh yeah, somebody else is at the bottom now, right? So I get it. I get wanting to just throw your hands up and be like, oh, okay, let me let them fight each other or whatever. But the problem is that you're both at the bottom. You're all at the bottom, right? If you don't have $1 billion right now, right, or even $1 million, right? If you don't have, a army at your back, right? If you're not in charge of the whole company, the whole organization, the whole nation, you're at the bottom, right? Because it's only a matter of time before they be like, all right, we done with them. You now, right? And at this very moment, even as they're, these certain people, I'm not even gonna say just immigrants right now, because this video can, or this idea can apply to anything, right? Even though I'm saying this video right here in this moment, recording this video, in this moment with this stuff going on, next week is gonna be something else, right? Next month is gonna be something else. Next year is gonna be something else, somebody else. And so that's why I want to be clear here that even though this moment right now is with a lot of the immigrants that's going on, this applies to everybody, right? If you're not one of those people I just mentioned, then you're at the bottom. And it's only a matter of time before you at the end of the gun, before you at the end of the rope, before they throwing you out the country, before they throwing you into the gulag or whatever, right? And so it's incredibly important to recognize why solidarity is so critical, why it's so important for us to connect with other people that also have these issues, right? And again, it's not, when I say issues, I don't mean just, this specific thing, or this specific, no, I mean the issue of being at the bottom of a rung. The issue of being in a hierarchy, right? That is the issue that we all are facing. No matter where you are in that hierarchy, the fact that you're in a hierarchy is the ultimate issue, in my opinion, right? And by recognizing that, then you are able to work together with people in a more cohesive way. You're able to form that solidarity. You're able to form the mutual aid groups. You're able to form the community that you need to create actual power, right? To create power that does not depend on these circumstantial things like having more money or more, political dick swinging power, right? Because all of that is contingent upon the fact that all the people at the bottom actually listen to them, right? Actually care what those digital currencies do, or what gold is, even though that's literally just a shiny rock, right? Even the military, we have to remember the military is full of people like you, full of people who decided to go there because they wanted more power, because they wanted more stability, right? And if you're able to connect with them on a human level, then you can evaporate a lot of that power and bring it down to our level, right? Now, I want to make sure it's clear also that this solidarity does not mean you're ignoring the specific problems, the specific issues, the single issues, if you want to say, that we each have. For instance, one of the biggest problems that anarchism has faced over the last 100 years is trying to work with, communists, for instance, specifically like, I don't know, Marxist land. I don't know the term, but the communists who think that you have to control the state in order to, build the end goal of communism, right? And they, time after time, have gotten stabbed in the back by those folks, right? And is one of the reasons why anarchism has, I'm not even gonna say has failed, but it has certainly not impacted as much power and as much change as it could have, right? And the reason why I say I don't want to say failed is because anarchism has greatly has had some huge wins, right? In terms of the power of labor unions back then, the weekend, the fact that we have a weekend is largely thanks to anarchism working with a lot of these other, leftists, if you want to say, organizations. And it goes beyond leftists and right, because again, I'm going on another tangent here, but the whole left-right dichotomy is itself a focus on who has power rather than the rather than power in general, right? Yeah, I'll keep that for another video to really go into depth. But all that to say that anarchism to me is really important because it doesn't focus on, oh, let's put some people who let's put specific people in power. It's how can we make it so, how can we create a world in which all of us have the power to do what we need to do without, right, oppressing other people, right? So it's not about putting people in power. It's about creating a structure, a reality, a civilization, a society, whatever you want to call it, in which we all have power, right? And that's the difference, right? This is why I think that what I was saying. Oh yeah, the thing about single issues, or like the individual issues that we each have, is still very important. All right, the idea of like black people are facing specific things that are specific to them. Women are facing specific things for them. You know, trans issues, and a lot of different issues in various elements of the queer communities. Um, Poor people of various types. Rural people. All these different areas, all these different types of people, these different communities, if you want to call it, are facing unique issues, right? And the need to connect together, right, to form a broader base of solidarity does not mean that you should ignore those things, because that's another element that has caused, for instance, unions to fail over time, is because the unions were like, oh, it's all about class solidarity, right? And they end up not really caring about, for instance, black people, and that has created a space for the people in power to use black people to recognize that black people and black laborers and white laborers were not aligned, and they were able to use that to break a lot of the unions, right? And that has happened multiple times throughout history. In fact, that's how the initial chattel slavery was established here in America, is because at first everybody was basically being enslaved, but then Bacon's Rebellion, after all that stuff, they were like, you know what, we'll be easier here if we just say the black people are the slaves, and everybody else, you can be indentured servants. It's basically the same thing, but indentured servant sounds better, and you actually have a path towards freedom. They were still very poor, and most of them lived very similarly to slaves, if not worse in some instances. But because they made it look better, then you have that schism and support, between all these people. So all that to say, like, it's a time time proven strategy for those in power to separate those not in power by trying to outsize their differences, right? They're trying to spotlight their differences and things like that. And so when we're working together, we have to recognize, yes, we do have different things, but we should work together to solve those things, right? If somebody is, I'll put it like this, right? A big way in which I think a lot of these problems can be solved is by building better, right? By building dual power systems, by building structures and societies in which show what a better world can look like, right? A big problem I have with a lot of the movements today is that they're just protesting, or they're just, mobilizing, but with very little organization, right? They rarely ever create spaces in which people have a space to come back to, right? After they protested, or after they, did this, that, and the other. They rarely have built a stronghold where people can come back to and feel supported, feel that emotional care, go through that, get health reassurances and stuff like that. Or if they lose a job, to find, work, or if they lose a housing, right, to find some place to live. The point is that we need to build strongholds. We need to build communities, actual communities, where people feel that connection, where people feel supported, right? Because without that, then you don't have the ability to actually create solidarity, right? Because you're just gonna be going out and reacting instead of being proactive. Instead of being building towards something, you're just fighting against something, right? And that's incredibly important. That's why something I've been trying to do a lot. even though I've been struggling here and there, is building better futures. Is showing what better futures can look like. Because I think if people don't have a solid idea of what we can be fighting for, then they're just going to be kind of lost, right? They're just going to be fighting against until they lose steam. You have to have some place to come back to recover, but also to see progress, to see real tangible progress. And so I'm going to end this video by talking about some of the things we could have if we do form more of these solidarity spaces, right? More of these spaces where we're actually, seeing each other as full humans and being more aware of all of our needs, all of our wants and desires, and so on and so forth, right? Let me drink some water. Water intermission. I'm not going to edit this out. So we could be having community centers, right? By community centers, I mean an actual place where people can come to make decisions together about what's going on in their local communities, right? One of the biggest elements that made the civil rights movement, for instance, so powerful was because they had places to meet, right? And almost every revolution in history started in like a bar or pub or like a tavern, like some central place where all the people in the local area of all walks of life could just talk together, right? Where can we do that today? That's very rare. You try to do it on the internet, but the internet is so full of like anonymity that you can't really establish a strong sense of trust, right? And that trust is imperative. It's extremely important. And don't get me wrong, I think the internet is also very powerful. Like we can form some type of communal spaces there, but it takes a lot of effort, and people aren't really putting forth that effort, to create those spaces. And by having a community center where people can make decisions together, I think you can have a digital aspect to that, but it shouldn't just be digital, right? I think we need a digital and a physical together, right? We need to use the technology that we have to bring these things together, right? And we can do that and the reason for that, rather, I should say, is because you can get the best of both worlds, right? And by being more aware of the benefits of technology and the drawbacks, as well as the benefits of physical, what's the analog and the drawbacks of that, then you can be more intentional with how you build those things together, right? So that community space can be a space where you say, okay, we need to figure out all of the issues in the thing. So you then use the technology solution to document all the things that people have issues with, right? And then you can get an idea of all the issues that people are dealing with, and then you can actually communicate about those things, right? If you do that with just analog, then it can be very hard to keep track of what's what, and so you end up focusing on just one thing or just two things or whatever, because it's easier for us to memorize. All right, it's easier for us to talk about if we just look at on the board, you just write these things down here, or if you're just talking or whatever. But with digital, you can actually get a more solidified idea of that, right? You can get a more tangible idea of all the different issues people have, and you can do it asynchronously. So after you break the meeting, after you break up for the day, people can go back home like, oh, I forgot this other thing that I was thinking about, and they can add it to the board, right? And so that way you have this living document. You have an actual living document of what the community needs and what the community is looking for, and why, and stuff like that. And then you can make more informed decisions as to how you can actually tackle all those solutions, right? Or all those issues. And then in that community space, it shouldn't just be for decision making. Like obviously that's like the reason why people go there. But you should also recognize that in order for people to make good decisions, they have to be fed, right? They have to be housed. They have to be feel safe, right? Because these literally affect our brains, right? Our brains run on calories. Our brains run on energy, that we need food, right? And so people are starved on a regular basis. If people are living in unsafe environments on a regular basis, if people are living in emotionally traumatic environments, then literally the decisions you make will not be ideal, will not be the most rational, if you want to call it that, right? Because, and I say rational like that because like our I'm pretty sure there's research on this too, but like the way that we rationalize things is based on our environment, right? And so when you say somebody's being irrational, it's not that they're being literally irrational, as in they're not, making a lot. Then that it doesn't mean they're illogical, right? It doesn't mean that they're making decisions that don't make sense to them. They're making a decision that makes sense, right? Because in their current reality, whether through their perspective, their traumas, their environment, they're making a decision that they feel is logical, right? And so you have to understand that. So when you're in the community spaces and you're trying to make decisions around the whole community, you have to recognize that every person here has a different perspective, and that perspective is born out of their environment. That perspective is born out of, like I said, their food, their security, all these other things. And so that community space has to be a space where you can get access to solutions for these things, right? Where you can get access to food, you can get access to counseling, you can get access to childcare, to whatever the community needs, right? And by doing that, you can kind of see where I'm going here, I hope, is that you're already solving solutions. You're already giving the community what they need to be a better, stronger knit community, right? You're already, by just offering these things, by default, you're already probably solving half the things that the issues that they're going to bring in, all right? And so that's what I mean by, like, you're not just saying this is a single issue where, for instance, I've been in spaces where, we want to, I live in Atlanta, so I've said that before. So we had a thing about Stop Cop City for a long time, right? We were trying to stop Cop City, where they're trying to bulldoze this whole forest in order to build fucking a huge cop training yard, where they're literally throwing explosives at school buses to practice killing children. I don't know. Like they literally were bringing people from Israel, from IDF, to train them. So you can imagine what they're training for. That's a whole other issue we'll get into probably another day. But all that to say that in a lot of these things I've noticed, a lot of these spaces I noticed, people were talking about, yeah, stop Cop City, stop Cop City. And there was a lot of energy for it, but there was very little energy for the fact that, a lot of the people coming there were like homeless, or like, they were just stressed, right? A lot of these people were overworked, where they're working, 10, 12, 14-hour, 18-hour days trying to do all these things and do all this stuff. And so as they're trying to fight, the cops from destroying this beautiful, one of the last remaining old growth forests in Atlanta, by the way, while they're trying to stop all that, they're also like fighting themselves and fighting each other in a way, right? And I'm not gonna say because of that the whole thing failed, because it definitely wasn't because of that. It was a whole lot of other things, but I think that was a factor that made it so much harder for this Stop Cop City movement to really be successful, is because we didn't really have a great way of supporting all the people that were coming through here. We didn't really have a great way of saying, okay, we have a loss right now. Let's go back to this place to regroup, right? We have all these people coming in town. Let's put them over here so that if the cops try to bust them up, we have some place for them to go, right? Or all these other elements, like all these other factors are in there that make this sort of thing very difficult to do. And that's just a broad example. That's just like a big name example. There's many of these smaller examples that I've seen, but the point is that if we had a space where you can actually support these people in different ways, and support various elements of people's needs in different ways, that makes it way more powerful. And excuse me, when the cops inevitably come, when the government inevitably comes and be like, oh, let's bust this up, you have way more people that are on your side. You have way more people that are like, wait, what are you doing? Why you want to bust up, free childcare and like food kitchen and, all this other stuff? That's one of the things that made, for instance, the Black Panther Party so powerful for quite a while, is because, not because they were just militant. Like, yes, that was one element of it, but the bigger element, I think, and many people will probably agree, was that fact of like they were giving food to kids, and they were doing all these things for the community. But one of the things that I think ended up with them failing was the fact that they weren't looking at people as full people, right? It was very male centric. It was very patriarchal. A lot of the women were kind of casted aside, or even being abused in many instances. That made a lot of space for the FBI, the CIA to plant people, to create all these elements of discord and things like that. And so By being aware of all these things, then we can create movements in which we're supporting each other, in which we actually care about each other's needs on a number of bases. And so when we do have inevitably, those people try to come through and plant, spies and try to break up the elements, you can be like, no, we're not gonna, ignore this person's needs, or we're not gonna, go just off this op, just because it will look cool. We got to actually make sure we have good security culture. We actually got to make sure we have some place to go back to. We got to make sure we have alibis. We got to make sure we have, this, that, and the other. And so you make it a lot harder for people to come in and actually break up your movement, right? Spend a lot of time on that. There's a lot of other things I want to cover. So I'll kind of fly by these other things, and I'll make more videos probably to really get into these other elements here. But I think education centers is another huge element that we need to have, and these are places in which you're teaching people about all sorts of things, everything from not just the regular schooling stuff like math, science, and literature and all that other stuff, but also food production, right, and foraging, like how to find food, how to create food, and philosophy and art and arts and stuff like that. That's really important because that teaches you how to think, right? How to think about thinking and things like that, which allows you to make better decisions. History, and not just like a U.S. history or whatever, but long-term history, like what did humans do for 100,000 years ago? By understanding that, you can get a better understanding of what we can do today, what we should be able to do today. Another thing is manufacturing and maker spaces. So we need to be able to produce our own things, right, locally. So I was watching this great video by Smarter Every Day talking about them trying to make a product completely made in America, right? And I like how you pointed out that it's not just about manufacturing in America, right? It's about the fact that every community should be able to produce its own things, right? Because without that, then you're completely dependent on somebody else from somewhere else, right? And that means that community is weaker. That community is not able to help itself, right, when it needs it. If local business people have ideas, inventions, or whatever that they want to do, then they have to depend on the rates and the massive other companies and governments or whatever to get somebody else somewhere else to produce it. But if you have people locally who actually are producing things together, then you can invent more quickly. You can create more innovations locally. You can create more jobs locally. And that is extremely important. Mass and public transit, right? This dependency on car culture really weakens us as well. It kills us both literally in terms of like people getting ran over by cars, our kids getting ran over by cars, as well as the health factor, right? A lot of the emissions, a lot of the like there's plenty of studies that shows that kids around who are raised around like highways and like streets and stuff like that have higher rates of asthma, in which like deathly asthma too, not like just a little bit of asthma, but like they can die by that, right? Because of the rubber and the emissions that's coming up out of there. There's higher rates of plastics in our bloodstream because of the rubber and stuff like that comes from these cars, the paint and all this other stuff. So that is extremely harmful. Plus, the roads themselves are terrible, right? They take up a whole lot of land. They cause a lot of roadkill. They cause a lot of deforestation and stuff like that. And it also makes it, in terms of class solidarity, right? It really causes more of a schism between the rich and the poor, in which a lot of poorer folks struggle a lot to maintain a car, even to afford one, thereby reducing their opportunities to find more jobs and more resources. So if we have areas in which you can actually get around without the need of a car, then that's better all around for humans, the environment, the economy, if you want to call it like that. But as I like to view it as, is better for more holistic technologies, right? Where we're not just creating this one machine and all the technology is focused on what this one machine can do, but now we're focusing on what are all the different diverse ways in which we can move around the space, right? Where's the hot air balloons and the zeppelins and things like that, right? Where's the cool trains and trolleys and stuff like that we can have, right? What about like I was thinking about this thing of like building trains where you can have a train or a system that can help you like can crawl up the outside of a building so you can get up really tall buildings faster and all this other stuff, right? But anyways, all that to say that like we should have way better and more diverse range of transportation to get from point A to point B. Last point here is intercommunal summits and exchanges, where uh, even though I think local community building is extremely important, you should still be able to communicate with other people from other communities and establish those bonds, right? And so we should have more ways in which these small scale communities can communicate with these other spaces to talk about like their needs and how we can, if we're like sharing a water resource, for instance, how can we make sure that both communities are benefiting, or all the communities around that water space are managing that water space responsibly, but also able to benefit from it as well. And giving gifts to each other and stuff like that, and it's even establishing small scale trade agreements. And I emphasize on the small scale, because I think a big problem that we have today is this idea that we can have this global supply chains and trade across the world. But often what that ends up just doing is creating elements of more oppression, where you have these areas that are completely dependent upon other areas, and those areas in which are producing all the things are just like stuck in a cash crop situation, where they can't actually produce things that their community needs. They have to completely depend on selling all the things that they're creating in order to buy the things that they actually need. And the people who are buying all those resources from them can actually create, once again, the things that they the food that they need, or the products that they need. So on both ends it's terrible, right? It's a bad deal. But it looks good because we're pushing away the externalities, right? We're pushing away the cost, the actual cost of all these massive scale trade into the future, and to what we're seeing now in terms of like climate change and nation like wars, potentially destroying the entire system, making the entire system collapse upon itself. It creates a weaker system overall, right? Where you're less adaptable, less able to less anti-fragility, right? Less able to actually do things as a community. So, yeah, with all these elements together, I think we can create a much better world, in which where that's to me what anarchism is all about, right? That to me is what egalitarianism is all about: is people being completely self-sufficient and self-reliant, self-sustainable, and at the same time they're able to be social, they're able to be innovative, they're able to be creative with one another. And that's why I think it's really important to make sure that we see the enemy as authoritarianism, as hierarchy, not just as all these other individual things, because they're all related. And if we realize that, if we realize how we're related and how our problems are related, we can very much simplify how we do things, at the same time as give due diligence to the complexity of how we fix these simple things, right? Because every simplicity has complexity, and every complexity can be simplified. Just what the I don't know, little truism there. But yeah, that's it. I'll end it there. Little rant done. And thanks for listening, and let me know what you think. Have a good one. Bye bye.